This book was not fun light reading at all, and I think if it hadn't been for me saying in my last video that I was going to read and analyze it, I probably would have DNF'd it. Hi, my name is Moana, and this is my dog Spike, and I'm a reading and writing lover who disliked English class as both a student and a teacher, and I am now documenting my journey of rediscovering my love for words. Spike, do you want to say anything? Sometimes Spike has a lot to say, maybe just not right now. In this video, I'm going to be reading and analyzing 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Now, this book was not part of my required reading list when I was growing up, nor was it a part of my students' required reading list when I was teaching. But from what I understand, it is a part of many other schools' curricula because it is a great representation of both Latin American culture and history. It's also beautifully written with its descriptive imagery, detailed character development, and its carefully crafted plot. Furthermore, it's considered to be one of the pioneering works of magical realism, which I learned just a few years ago is one of my most favorite genres. So, what exactly is magical realism? It's a literary genre that incorporates magical or mythical elements into a realistic setting versus fantasy, where the majority of the story and setting is fantastical and there is much more heavy emphasis on the magic itself. So basically, magical realism is a real world where a few elements of magic are normal. The fantasy genre has been extremely popular lately, especially romantic fantasy, which many people refer to as romantasy. Personally, even though there are some fantasy books that I have enjoyed, I think I prefer magical realism more because the realistic nature of it allows me to picture the setting and the scenes more easily in my head since I can relate to it much more with elements of my own life. I previously read another story of the magical realism genre, which led me to want to read more in that category, and that's when I heard about 100 Years of Solitude. This book must be super popular because when I first looked up the digital download through my public library months ago, I was something like number 100 in line to get the book, and I found out that there is supposed to be a 2-season series based on the story coming out on Netflix this December, which might explain why so many people are reading it right now. So if you're someone who likes to read books and then watch the movie or TV show that's based on it, you might want to start reading this one now so that you'll be ready to watch the series in December. For my first literary analysis in a previous video on my channel, I read Shakespeare's Macbeth and I mostly griped about how difficult it was to read, so I feel kind of embarrassed now to say that I had a hard time with the beginning of this story as well and felt confused from the start. The language itself wasn't complicated, but it felt like there was a lot going on and a lot of jumping backwards and forwards in the timeline, which I found confusing. I did look up an analysis of this book online, and according to SparkNotes, the author purposely wrote it that way to disorient the reader and add to the magical whimsy of the story. In the first few chapters, we're introduced to two main characters of the story, Jose Arcadio Buendia and Ursula Iguaran. Both are born in a small village, and even though they are cousins, they decide to marry each other. They are warned by the people around them not to have children, since incest can lead to genetic defects, and there were other members of the family who did so, and their child was born with a pig's tail. So Ursula refuses to consummate their marriage. The lack of consummation eventually leads the people of the village to make fun of Jose Arcadio Buendia. One of the villagers named Prudencio Aguilar says that Buendia must be impotent, which leads to Buendia killing him out of anger. Buendia ends up so racked with guilt that he leaves the village with his wife and several other people, and after many months of traveling, they end up settling somewhere and create a village that they name Macondo. Fast forward to several years later, and Macondo is a peaceful village, and Jose Arcadio Buendia and his wife have 2 sons after Ursula finally had given in to her husband's insistence of consummating their marriage. Gypsies travel to the village regularly to share wondrous inventions from different parts of the world, and Jose Arcadio Buendia is fascinated with these and spends most of his time lost in studying science and alchemy together with his youngest son, Aureliano. His oldest son, Jose Arcadio, is seduced by another villager named Pilar Ternera. This is where the story becomes quite funny because she becomes very attracted to Jose Arcadio because of his very large man part, if you know what I mean by that. The author of this story spent a lot of time poetically describing how well endowed Jose Arcadio is, And as I read it, I was so grateful that this book was not part of the curriculum that I was required to teach, because I couldn't imagine having to talk about this in a classroom full of 13-year-olds. To be honest, it was so poetic that it was almost beautiful the way that Marquez wrote about their physical acts with each other, that I almost missed what he was talking about, and maybe it would have just confused my young teenage students. But I think it would have been even worse to have to explain to them what happened, because Pilar Ternera eventually becomes pregnant with Jose Arcadio's son. And with that, I feel like my students would have asked what happened to make all this develop. So Jose Arcadio is a teenager who has impregnated Pilar Ternera, who is a grown woman, but he meets a young gypsy girl who he falls in love with and follows her when the gypsies leave Macondo, basically abandoning a pregnant Ternera. Ursula tries to go after Jose Arcadio, even though she had just given birth to a daughter named Amaranta, who she ends up leaving behind for her husband to take care of. Ursula comes back to the village 5 months later, looking and dressing very differently, and we learn that instead of finding the gypsies to bring her son back, she had come into contact with civilization outside of Macondo. With this new connection to the outside world, we start to see the village of Macondo change as well as expand. The Buendia family continues to grow throughout the story, and one thing I gotta say is that the list of characters becomes so confusing that I actually had to look up several family maps to keep the story straight in my head. Many of the characters share the same name as their predecessors, and I learned that the author was very intentional in doing that, because what we see throughout the story is that the characters with certain names all share specific personality traits. So for example, every person with the name of Jose Arcadio has a restless, inquisitive spirit, while every person with the name Aureliano tends more towards melancholy and being solitary in nature. One day, an orphan named Rebecca shows up, and the Buendias take her into their family as one of their own, but she suffers from insomnia that is so severe that it causes memory loss. And in this story, this insomnia is like a disease that quickly spreads throughout the whole village, and soon everybody is unable to sleep and forgetting everything, to the point where they have to label everything and put up giant signs to help them remember things that they don't want to forget, such as one that reminds them that God exists. The insomnia is finally cured one day when one of the gypsies who previously passed away comes back from the dead and arrives in the village with the antidote. From this point on, we start to see the idea of colonialism developing, because a town magistrate from the central government arrives in Macondo for the first time and starts administering rules over the people. Up until now, the people of Macondo consisted of the individuals who originally established the village as well as their children, and they lived peacefully without any outside intervention. So they're not happy with an outsider coming in and telling them what to do, but Jose Arcadio Buendia is able to negotiate a deal with him to relinquish most of his power and leave the village alone for the most part. Some time passes and some characters are wed, some have children, and some pass away. But eventually we see that a church is being built in the village for the first time. Social and political turmoil starts to brew, and eventually there is an all-out war that erupts between the conservatives, who are generally village outsiders, and the liberals. So this is the part of the story where I started to feel uncomfortable and wanted to stop reading it. Right now, as I am reading 100 Years of Solitude, it is November 2024, and here in the United States, we just finished a very polarizing election, and I don't understand what is happening, but it feels like everything is becoming political and there's so much anger and negativity everywhere. It's gotten to the point where it's been so bad that I, as well as many other people, have had to stop watching the news and going on social media for weeks or even months, because the negativity has been too overwhelming. So I was not happy to see it in the book that I'm reading. I almost wanted to DNF this book, but I had been waiting so long to read it that I decided to force myself to get through it. And I'm glad that I did, because it was still a good story, even though I wasn't in the mood to hear about a war between conservatives and liberals. So one thing that my own personal experience of reading this book made me think about is that in my case, if I feel uncomfortable having to hear about turmoil in society, I can choose to live in a bit of ignorance and not watch the news, and I can avoid social media. However, for people who live in a time and place where there is all-out civil war, they don't have that option, and not only do they have to hear about the angry rhetoric, but they also have to worry about protecting their own lives as well as the lives of others they care about. So even though there is a lot of negativity out there right now, I still feel very fortunate that I can kind of turn all of that stuff off. I'm not saying that I'm trying to live in total ignorance, but it's just that I've been feeling really exhausted with it being up in my face all the time. So it's nice to be able to focus on just being human rather than being a person of a specific political or societal view. That's my dog's Spike. So going back to the story, eventually the liberals lose the war, but we see that it actually isn't over because the rebels continue to launch more uprisings against the conservative government. A peace treaty is signed between the two groups, but the turmoil is still far from over. At this point in the story, Jose Arcadio Buendia has already passed away, and although his wife Ursula is still alive, both her physical and mental health has greatly deteriorated. One of their descendants builds a railroad that links Macondo to the outside world, which leads to capitalists creating a banana plantation inside of the village, as well as their own town right outside. With the advancement of capitalism, Macondo develops rapidly, and along with commercialism comes the arrival of many foreign prostitutes. This part of the story gave a bittersweet feeling because we can see how the development of the banana industry brought extra wealth and technology to the village, but it's almost like the people's innocence is lost now that they're no longer living their simple way of life. When I was growing up and I was still young and much more naive, I thought that every society would embrace advancement and civilization. Even though I've learned more about the negative effects of colonialism and imperialism throughout history, I can see that there are some positives, such as advancements in technology that can lead to a better quality of life as well as a longer life. However, in this story, we can see how colonialism and capitalism brings an inequality to Macondo that we didn't see before. It becomes clear that the conservative government is supporting the capitalist banana plantation owners. Thousands of people are forced to work under inhumane conditions on the plantation, which causes them to go on strike led by Jose Arcadio Segundo. The government declares martial law, and the striking workers retaliate by sabotaging the plantation. The government then invites the workers to gather for a meeting to try to work towards a resolution, but this turns out to be a trap, and the army ends up shooting down and killing all of them with machine guns. Jose Arcadio Segundo somehow finds himself waking up in a train full of the dead bodies of the plantation workers, which are supposed to be dumped out at sea. He is able to get off the train and walk back to Macondo, and to his shock, as well as to ours as the reader of the story, none of the villagers have any recollection of the massacre, and they don't believe his account that it happened. In the following days, the army and the government continued to hunt down and kill any union leaders while covering up any evidence of the massacre and manhunt. So basically, at the hands of the capitalists and the government, it's like the 3,000 plantation workers who were fighting for humane working conditions never existed. This sounds crazy, like something out of a Twilight Zone episode, but several years back, I actually did see a documentary about colonialism in South America and the horrible conditions of banana plantations. One would hope that at this point in our modern day society, such inhumane things do not happen anymore, but honestly, I still feel a twinge of discomfort every time I eat a banana. It starts to rain in Macondo, which is a dry area that hardly ever sees wet weather, but this rain turns out to be a disaster for the village. The owner of the banana plantation agrees to giving the plantation workers better working conditions once the rain stops, but we see that this is an empty promise because the heavy rains last for 5 years, almost like it is under the will of the plantation owner. This leads to the deterioration of structures in the village, as well as the death of livestock and crops. When the rain finally stops, the banana plantation is gone, and this seems to reflect how in our real-life world, what happens when an industry finds that it is no longer profitable to exploit a certain group of people? They just move on. The end of the story is mostly about the personal affairs between the remaining Buendia family members and what happens to the village. For the reasons that I shared earlier, I found this book to be a mentally and emotionally uncomfortable read, and there were times when I just wanted it to be over, but once it was finished, I was kind of sad to no longer be immersed in the world of a village named Macondo with the Buendia family. The story was so beautifully written, and although I found it difficult to keep up with who was who, Marquez did such an amazing job with the character development that I really felt like I knew and understood the characters on a personal basis. Each character was complex with their own motivations and intricacies, and not a lot of authors are able to skillfully craft a story that allows us to see that. I truly think that Marquez is an artist where the words are like his paints on a canvas, and this book is his masterpiece. The funny thing is that I've seen several other people speak about this book on BookTube, and I've noticed that you either really like it or really hate it, and I can actually understand the reasoning from both sides. For example, there is a lot of sex and incest in this story, which can make people feel really uncomfortable for obvious reasons. But if you go past the surface and really dig deep, you'll find that it's all part of Marquez's way of showing us how the Buendia family had the tendency to stick only to themselves, thereby isolating their family and keeping themselves separated from the rest of the village. So rather than it being a story of inappropriate sexual relationships, it's a symbol of how the family as a whole relates to the rest of society. Another thought-provoking element is that I personally do not support cheating at all. And I always get angry whenever I hear stories about infidelity. But when it came to the relationship of two of the characters, Aureliano Segundo and Fernanda del Carpio, I found that I disliked the wife so much that I was actually rooting for the husband to leave her for his mistress. This actually left me feeling confused because now I normally would never support cheating, but it doesn't sound like a divorce is a thing in this family, or rather in this entire society as a whole. And since Fernanda was such an unlikable wife, I actually found myself feeling disappointed every time Aurelio Segundo went back home to her. I did love this story and I'm glad that I read it, but I'm so glad that I did so as an adult rather than as a high school student, or rather than as a teacher reading it together with my students. I think there was too much adult content, and even though it was written tastefully as a means to further develop the story, I think its symbolism would be missed by younger readers, and I can imagine them just laughing and saying how gross it is. Like I shared earlier, Netflix is coming out with a series on this book in December, and I just saw the trailer and it looks so amazing. With the way that this story has so many traces of magical realism in its imagery, I can't wait to see how it comes to life on screen. In one video that gave a sneak peek of behind the scenes of filming, the crew explained that it's been the most expensive series that Netflix has created in South America so far, and they have taken up miles and miles of land to create the setting for the series. I don't think I've ever been more excited to watch any book-to-screen adaptation, and I feel like it's going to be a Christmas present to me to be able to watch it in December. This story was so intense that I wanted my next read to be something really light, and with Thanksgiving coming up next week, I thought I would check out a funny Thanksgiving cozy mystery that I found. And I tried reading some of it today, and I actually found that it was way too light, like it was the complete opposite of what 100 Years of Solitude was. And I found it hard to just flick the switch into the headspace of reading a book for just pure entertainment. So I'm still on the lookout for my next read, and I have no idea what it's going to be yet, but I'm hoping that it will be something Thanksgiving themed. If you have any suggestions, I would love to hear it in the comments. If you aren't already, please make sure that you subscribe to my channel to see what I read next. And if you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also, before I close, one of the reasons why I wanted to start a BookTube channel was that I wanted it to be a place where I could have great discussions on the books that I've been reading. So I would like to hear from you. Let me know in the comments what would make you DNF a book. And also, have you read this book already, 100 Years of Solitude? If you did you like it or did you not? And why or why not? And if you haven't read it yet, will you read it after watching my video? I would really love to hear from you. Thank you again, and I will see you soon. Bye!